This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. Crisis time for the summer game. Since last March, rumors and news stories linking Pete Rose to gambling have whizzed about the Cincinnati manager's head like so many fastballs. Today, Pete Rose fired back. Correspondent Frank Courier has our report.
Pete Rose hurled a beanball today at the baseball commissioner's 4-month-old investigation into gambling allegations.
Can you tell us something about your lawsuit, Mr. Rose?
No, I can't.
His attorneys today filed suit, charging Commissioner Bart Giamatti with being biased and prejudging the case. They want a jury trial instead of next Monday's scheduled hearing in New York, when Rose was to answer charges he bet on baseball games, including his own team, the Reds.
I prefer people who can play baseball to people who can sling money.
Calling Giamatti's 225-page investigative report on Rose full of false accusations and errors, Rose lawyers today accused baseball of trying to bolster the credibility of his accusers, 2 of them convicted felons. Former bodybuilder Paul Jansen, they say, was trying to blackmail the Cincinnati Reds manager. Jansen claims he phoned in most of Rose's bets and says Rose owed him $40,000. And former bookmaker and convicted drug dealer Ron Peters, in hopes of getting a lighter sentence, Rose lawyers say, told investigators Rose bet regularly on Reds games. In an exclusive interview with CBS News, Peters said that Rose bet up to $20,000 a day on baseball games between 1984 and 87.
He always bet the same amount. He always bet on his team. He never bet against his team.
Were there days that Rose didn't bet on the Reds?
Well, if he called, he bet on the Reds every time that I can remember. There was times he didn't call, but when he called, he bet on them.
Some of the most damning evidence against Rose are the piles of betting slips that Peters provided, which Rose attorneys claim today have been altered.
This is one of Pete's daily betting sheets. And on it is the teams, the amount, if they won, if they lost.
How much money are we looking at in one day bet on baseball?
Well, let's see, bet 25, 35, 55, 80, 90, 140, 160, $17,500.
Pete Rose bet $17,500
on Tuesday, July 7th. All on
Major
baseball.
League Baseball.
All on baseball.
Who is to be believed, the baseball legend Pete Rose or Ron Peters? Why should the public believe you?
I don't want to do this. I have no reason to do this. They came to me. I didn't come to them. Their investigation led to me.
If Peters is to be believed, and Giamatti has indicated as much in a letter last April to a federal judge, Rose could be suspended for a year for betting on baseball, or banned for life if he bet on the Reds. Rose's legal attempt today to shift the case for the commissioner to the courts is not, according to experts, based on any precedent.
It makes Pete Rose's motives look quite more questionable. He called for the hearing on Giamatti's part. Now he's calling for taking Giamatti out of the picture, and I think that seems like an apparent inconsistency on Pete Rose's part.
Today's lawsuit asks the court to name an impartial decision-maker in the case and asks for unspecified dollar damages, compensation for what his attorneys call the destruction of Pete Rose's reputation. Frank Courier, CBS News, Chicago.
Barry Switzer, who put together the 4th best winning percentage in the history of college football, resigned today as head coach at the University of Oklahoma. The 51-year-old Switzer stepped down with drug, rape, and assault charges against some of his Oklahoma players. The university's football program also is on 3-year probation for violations, including the payment of cash to a football recruit.
I want this resignation to stand for something. I want it to serve as a public commitment on my part to join with other coaches around the country who are calling for a change in rules that permit universities to provide players a reasonable assistance, perhaps based on financial need. The time has come to change a system where coaches must choose between abiding by certain rules or acting like caring individuals.
A federal judge in Chicago today sentenced 2 sports agents to prison for signing college athletes to illegal contracts. The judge sentenced 57-year-old Norby Walters to 5 years in prison and 29-year-old Lloyd Bloom to 3 years. They were convicted in April of using money and cars to lure college stars into signing agreements in violation of college rules. The nation's doctors are arming for a battle royal with Congress. At issue is enormous and always growing federal spending on medical care for older Americans, Medicare. The dispute over Medicare dominated today's session of the American Medical Association convention, as we hear from CBS News medical correspondent Susan Spencer.
Doctors at the annual AMA convention fumed as they watched replays of congressional speeches last week on ET, nickname for a sweeping cost-cutting plan they say will endanger the health of 30 million Americans on Medicare.
I think this whole thing about expenditure targets is going to be devastating to the American public. It's the people who are going to suffer.
ET means expenditure target. The plan making its way through Congress would set a target each year for overall Medicare spending. Exceed the target one year, and the government would cut reimbursements to doctors the next.
We don't need some mathematician with a $15 calculator trying to decide how much money people need to be taken care of when they are sick.
The American Medical Association cares nothing except to not limit the income of individual doctors.
Not so, says an indignant AMA, which in a letter to Congress calls the plan cynical and dangerous, and says seniors and the disabled will suffer because doctors will be forced to ration services to meet targets. Plan supporters deny it would lead to any rationing of care.
Now, the number of patients is only growing by 2% a year, so they're doing more things to the same number of patients. We've got to cut that down a little bit.
Medicare is currently galloping along, the cost of its programs growing 15% a year. The administration last week embraced this proposal to limit it.
It has been projected by the year of 2005, physician payments under Part B would be the largest entitlement program in our federal budget.
The AMA vows to use all its political muscle on this one, and it may have to. Medicare currently gobbles up 1 in every 5 American health care dollars, and Congress now seems ready to take the doctors on. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Washington.
Still to come on the CBS Evening News. Bruce Morton on suggestions for major change in the junior high schools. And Juan Vasquez on a machine that's as much fun and as dangerous as it looks. Spend at least some time in prison. The request came in a pre-sentencing memo to federal judge Gerhard Gesell. The memo charges the convicted former National Security Council aide lied at his trial and has not shown, quote, one iota of remorse. North is scheduled to be sentenced Friday. The U.S. and the Soviet Union today opened a new round of talks on strategic arms. They're trying to work out the last and most difficult problems blocking a treaty to reduce long-range nuclear missiles. Each side brought in a new chief negotiator, but as correspondent Doug Tennell reports, their positions were mostly unchanged.
At the American mission in Geneva today, the Bush administration made its first foray into the most complex and most difficult arms control quandary of them all, the world of strategic or long-range missiles. The first formal session on strategic arms since talks were halted 7 months ago ended after only 80 minutes.
I was able in the discussions to describe President Bush's overall approach to arms control, emphasizing the president's commitment to reducing the risk of nuclear war.
After today's meeting, Mikhail Gorbachev's chief negotiator sounded optimistic.
I'm satisfied. It was a good start.
But on the big issues like Star Wars, mobile missiles, and air and sea-launched cruise missiles, there is not even a hint of movement, at least not yet. One key word used to describe the Bush approach to these talks is continuity. No major changes from the Reagan administration. But what that also means is no new solutions to old problems that blocked an accord on strategic arms when the talks were suspended 7 months ago. Doug Tennell, CBS News, Geneva.
President Bush may be the first American leader in decades to signal that reducing nuclear missiles is not his top arms control priority. Mr. Bush sent his nuclear negotiators to Geneva with no new bold proposals and no urgent deadlines for a deal, a sharp contrast to his conventional arms initiative where he wants both big cuts and quick action.
And we should aim to reach an agreement within 6 months to a year.
After years in which nuclear issues dominated arms control, the president for the first time has put troops on the table right along with silos and missile launchers.
The fact that we're putting more emphasis on conventional now emphasizes that we have neglected that for a long time.
And while the president would move quickly on conventional arms reductions, critics say on long-range missiles, the president appears to be slowing things down. In the strategy for the Geneva talks announced today, Mr. Bush is asking the Russians to agree to test in advance how long-range missile cuts would be verified. In effect, a demand that both sides try out their anti-cheating techniques before writing them into the final treaty. Advanced visits to each other's ICBM missile sites is one example. Critics accuse the president of a delaying tactic.
Bush's new initiative will stall the progress in START and can only delay any favorable outcome in the treaty.
This policy to reduce troops quickly but nuclear arms slowly is once again partly due to the president's distrust of the Soviets. A senior administration official says Mr. Bush views nuclear weapons as the crown jewels of America's defense and wants to test the Soviets before he cuts the missiles. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, the White House.
Violence is reported in yet another of the Soviet Union's restive southern republics. The TASS news agency says armed youths went on a rampage in Kazakhstan and that some people were killed. No word on what led to the violence, but relations have been tense between native Cossacks and ethnic Russians who work in the area. China expelled another American journalist today. Joe Kahn of the Dallas Morning News was charged with violating martial law. The Chinese government said he, quote, fabricated rumors that many people were killed by soldiers in Tiananmen Square, unquote. While Chinese authorities are trying to harass and intimidate Western reporters, they're taking the opposite line with business people. John Sheehan reports.
Following the slaughter of peaceful protesters at Tiananmen Square, about 7,000 Americans fled China, including most of the business people.
We felt, we saw bodies, we heard shooting, we saw people falling. We saw the results the next day.
The exodus halted operations in nearly all of the 175 American-Chinese joint venture companies, representing U.S. investments of $3.5 billion.
One of the symbols of American business in China, Kentucky Fried Chicken, was also one of the first to reopen after the massacre. But there hasn't been a stampede of U.S. businessmen coming back.
Ironically, the same Chinese propaganda department that issues daily anti-American attacks also shows Americans signing business deals, reassuring the Chinese public that U.S. business has not been driven away. In fact, a few are getting out, even one of China's oldest friends.
From a high floor of the Peking Hotel on Sunday afternoon, I watched the troops shoot down unarmed people who had just come up to talk.
For more than 40 years, Harvard-educated farmer and Marxist Bill Hinton has helped China with agricultural projects and joint ventures. Now he says he's fed up with the hardline leaders who ordered the killings.
As long as these men are in charge, I won't come back to work.
So there's a tug of war going on. The State Department says it's too soon to return because the situation in China remains unstable. But Chinese officials are trying to convince American businessmen to come back.
What they're saying is your competitors are back on the job. The Japanese are back.
The Chinese government is right about that. The Japanese are back, and in such numbers that the Japanese Foreign Ministry admonished them to be more discreet about it. Just as China is dependent on foreign money and technology, most foreign companies have investments to protect. A U.S. trade official predicts that half the American businessmen who fled will be back by the end of this month, nearly all of them a month after that, regardless of their feelings about the brutal crackdown on the students. John Sheehan, CBS News, Beijing.
Officials from the United States, China, Japan, and South Korea are meeting this week in Seattle to talk about the nuts and bolts of trade in the booming Pacific Rim. As David Dow reports, the events in China shook up today's proceedings.
Historically, these meetings of U.S. and Asian port officials have gone almost unnoticed. But today, there were a few demonstrators outside, and inside, a walkout by a Seattle port commissioner protesting the involvement of Chinese officials.
I can't sit down with these people in good faith and try to do business with people
who are murdering their own people at home.
In fact, business does continue with China. A few hours before this morning's meeting and just a few miles away, a Chinese ship loaded up with American products. But it's becoming clearer that it is not business as usual, at least for the time being.
Companies that were contemplating new investments in China will not go ahead until the situation changes. And even if it changes, it may take several years for the confidence to come back.
Muhammad Malikpour hopes that it happens sooner than that. Long before the Beijing massacre, he committed his U.S. firm to a $1 billion development in the Chinese port city of Tianjin. He's determined to follow through, hoping he can lure investors.
Many investors is concerned about in this whole China situation.
U.S. companies have already invested $3.5 billion in China, and so far, the big ones, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and others, appear to be holding firm on their joint ventures. But some U.S. industries have become increasingly dependent on trade with China, which grew 37% last year. And in the apparel industry, for instance, importers are beginning to shop around.
Some companies import more than 50% of their goods from China, which means they would be vulnerable to continued turmoil.
Meanwhile, even China's port officials were busy today trying to reassure American business.
All the foreign investment in China will be protected by China.
But many Americans want more than words. They want proof that a China turned more repressive is not also turning back the economic clock. David Dow, CBS News, Seattle.
What do you take for diarrhea? Oh, the old standby. If you're like most people, lots and lots of the old standby.
To leap beyond the world of worry. 50% of the Fortune 500 have placed their trust in the travelers to help provide financial peace of mind. You're better off under the umbrella.
The chief author of a major new education report says America's middle grade schools are the last chance to reach our young people. The report says that all too often that last best chance is being missed, frequently with tragic results. Bruce Morton explains.
America's early adolescents, the 10 to 15-year-olds, are in trouble.
Like, I know a lot of friends that are in 6th grade and all. They smoke and they drink, and I know people in 7th and 8th grade that do.
Everyone is more unhappy, and no one can talk about anything because people think they're strange or they're out of it.
92% of recent high school graduates had started drinking. 56% of them had started while in the 6th through 9th grades. The proportion of young people becoming sexually active before age 16 is up dramatically. Minority kids especially are likely to drop out in those early adolescent years. 40% of Hispanic dropout is in or before 9th grade. The suicide rate for 10 to 14-year-olds more than doubled during the 1980s.
What does it take anyway to grow up healthy, vigorous, inquiring, and adaptable?
The Carnegie Council suggests some answers, all of them things that have worked in one community or another. First, smaller schools.
We made a mistake. We built big buildings. It's more efficient. Why do we have to make a mistake and have big schools?
Smaller schools, maybe several schools in one school building.
Schools within schools, teams of teachers and kids.
Fairly permanent teams of teachers and kids working one-on-one. No tracking, brighter kids helping slower kids along. An emphasis on basic skills, an emphasis on health care and health education. The phrase sex education is not used. More community involvement, more control for teachers, less for bureaucrats.
Are there money problems? Yes, there are. Should there be more help from the federal government? Yes, there should. Is that an excuse for us not to do more now? No, it's not.
Total costs, the report doesn't guess. Will there be opposition? Sure. A reporter from Children's Express pointed that out.
There are a lot of teachers who won't want to implement the changes, such as allowing kids to work in groups. They're probably afraid that total chaos will reign instead of productive group work.
The teaching community has been moving toward a lot of these ideas, but no one today suggested change would be easy or quick. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Washington.
A first-of-its-kind public access system is going online at the Environmental Protection Agency. It's a new database of toxic discharges into the air, sea, and ground. Covered are discharges of 320 toxic chemicals as reported by 20,000 plants. With a home computer and phone hookup and for a fee, Americans can check the pollution record of plants in their own communities. Meanwhile, the Natural Resources Defense Council today listed what it says are the biggest industrial sources of cancer-causing pollutants in the air. It charges that Eastman Kodak is the worst. Officially arrives on Wednesday, and in those lazy, hazy days of summer, carefree times on the beach can be jeopardized by careless behavior in the water. Juan Vasquez reports concern about water safety this summer includes a jet age threat.
They're fun, they're fast, they're noisy. And they can be dangerous.
Everything going on in the water, man, trip out. It's awesome. Speed, the faster you go, the funner it is.
They're called water bikes or jet skis, but those who worry about safety are starting to call them a menace.
It's not inherently dangerous simply by the way that it's built, but the way that they're used can be very dangerous.
They are unsafe.
Lourdes Aramis' 9-year-old son, Eric, was killed in a water bike accident this spring in Miami's Biscayne Bay, the third death in Florida this year. Critics say most accidents are caused by careless operators.
I tell you, they shouldn't be swimming in here while there's jet skis, people riding jet skis in here. It's very, very dangerous.
When you mix individuals with jet skis and power boats, you're creating a dangerous condition. It's an accident waiting to happen.
As a result of recent accidents, Florida's legislators have passed the nation's first statewide law regulating water bikes. It would outlaw jumping wakes, playing chicken, and weaving through congested waters, setting an age limit of 14 for operators.
A lot of kids that are, 14 years old and younger, they just can't handle the skate.
A verbal warning for you to stay off the beach and stay away from the swimmers.
The Florida law is expected to become a model for other states, but Marine police say that with an estimated 200,000 water bikes in use across America today and sales booming, the problem is likely to get worse. Juan Vasquez, CBS News, Miami.
And that's tonight's CBS Evening News. Dan Rather. See you tomorrow. Good night.
Whoa, nice submarine, though.
I'm Kathleen Sullivan. Tomorrow, the real Mississippi burning, relatives of the civil rights workers killed 25 years ago. Also, Robin Williams joins us on CBS This Morning.
This is CBS.
There's a lot